Hi, I'm Daniel Ryan, and I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney and delighted to be in part of this book. I was responsible for doing the introduction to climate and ecology, and really, I guess what I was trying to do there was to give a little bit of an overview about climate and ecology, and weave some of the work of the papers in this section into it. One thing I guess is just to note when I was starting to write it, the war in Ukraine was really quite new, and so too was the sense of there being a post-COVID era. So I want to make the point really that there was a shift in thinking going on about climate and indeed energy. So where kind of really, in a sense, some of devices that architects were using um, and designs really been seen to be important to combat climate change for ecological reasons. In many cases, you were starting to see the emergence through the war in Ukraine that these are actually morphing into devices about national security. So this thing, I guess, of the environment almost being divorced to politics certainly was far from true, and particularly either in the sense of climate or indeed ecology. Um, I give an overview of climate as an architectural concept during the 20th century and sort of dip in and out of that across the paper. Particularly, one thing interested in is the idea of climatic design as really a biopolitical tool and a socio-political one as well. And I draw attention to the residue of environmental determinism in discourses on climatic design. That sense that really kind of climate, our control of it could determine civilization. And this sort of you still see kind of coming through today in terms of discussion and discourse around standards of thermal comfort in buildings. I think though there's a tension maybe in many of the papers in this section really about um, where most authors recognize links between capitalism and ecological destruction. And the question really is actually often how to find productive niches that resist at least capitalism's worst excesses. I think Sarah Breen Lovett and Sabine Letmand address this in the sense that for their papers, they show that this could start with awareness by being more mindful, how we build and choose, make our choices about consumption. And I think using the lens of consumption is interesting to consider maybe better fits between material culture and the environment, and often advocating questions around slowing down rather than speeding up. I was impressed too by how many of the authors point to questions around intersectionality, in that often projects of marginal communities have lessons about world building, community, and better land relations, and how often cultural diversity maps onto ecological diversity too. And I draw attention too to maybe the a number of Indigenous First Nations scholars in particularly around Australia and how they've been thinking and repositioning notions really of about moving from perhaps an egocentric worldview to an ecocentric one, or sorry, from an yeah to an ecocentric one. Um, Many designers, I think, seek to innovate with ecologically benign materials and processes, but one of the difficulties faced is that really so-called nature has become increasingly bureaucratized. And Rachel Armstrong draws attention to this, noting really how biomaterials can't be easily incorporated into standard building developments. And they tend to be regulated often with a single environmental goal in mind. So, we think about insulation, typically kind of regulated in terms of reducing energy consumption or perhaps improving thermal performance, but often the ecological sides of the what kind of materials we're using often are not really being considered. So we can use quite ecologically destructive materials in our buildings, but that still seems to be fine for many people. And I think Rachel's work kind of points to an alternate way of thinking about it, and instead think about materials really within a shared ecology within a household, and how we might be more mindful of behavior and redesign material flows, so that all parts of the process are ecologically benign. Um, there's also, I think it's important too to recognize, maybe as part of that history, to note that the way we're thinking about architectural history also is changing. Greg Kreisler and all's work kind of point to that. And I give a little overview as well of a couple of kind of broader works done recently, kind of that look at changing ideas about climate and ecology within architectural discourse. And I think that part really throw open, some of the authors throw open new case studies of architecture with a capital A that better engage with climate, maybe as better models to work from, but also think about some of the blind spots and environmental obsessions of architecture at different moments. I think, like many, I'm quite skeptical about the attempts to merge capitalism and sustainability under the ruse of natural capitalism, but it's important still to be aware of how these ideas developed and the promises that they held, and for some still hold, and how development and modernization agendas joined up with a more globalized environmental culture in the 1980s. Greg Kreisler et al.'s paper advanced this critique well, that culture of solutionism often was more about maintaining the status quo of social relations, but with less waste. And I think at the other end, there's also a disconnect between theoretical solutions and lived reality, as Tweed and Patterson in their paper show. So my chapter really concludes that architecture's relationship to climate and ecology is complex. Our tools to deal with climate or ecology seem to offer the promise of consensus, but rarely live up to expectations. And as the various papers in the section show, we need better stories and more mindful communities rather than better checklists.